Ronnie Van Zant had quite the reputation in the rock world. But how did he do it? How did an auto parts worker rise from the shadows to become one of the most talented and most fearsome name in the rock and roll business? To find out, we have to go back to the very beginning. Van Zant was born in 1948 in Jacksonville, Florida. He wasn't just a regular kid. He came from a family with a colorful past. His dad, Lacey Austin Van Zant, was a truck driver who had once tried his hand at prize fighting, and as a result of that, he made sure his sons knew how to handle themselves, taking a punch and throwing one even better. So, Ronnie grew up with a bit of grit, often hitting the road with his dad. But if you're wondering how Ronnie eventually got into music and grew to become the rock star we know him as, well, it started when he and his dad would drive around, and while his father was working, Ronnie would be bored. Nothing else to do than listen to some music on the radio. What started as something to cure boredom grew into becoming the reason Ronnie fell in love with music, and the one thing that inspired the rest of his career. Little by little, he began to nurse the ambition to be a musician himself. He wanted nothing more, and nothing else added a spark to his life. He was determined to go into music, so by the time he was 16, he was already making waves, forming a band called Us, and proudly taking on the role of lead singer. His first successful trial at music. This was it. But sadly, things went a little downhill from there. Unfortunately, Us didn't stick around for long. They flamed out pretty quickly, and this could have been the end of a music career for him. But Ronnie was not one to give up. He had learned a lot from his father, and one of those lessons was to keep going, regardless of what life throws at you. So instead of sulking, he launched into his next musical venture, starting a band called My Backyard. This was where things really began to come together. For this new band, he teamed up with some of his schoolmates, and they were talented guys: Bob Burns, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, and Larry Junstrom, and they realized they had something special brewing. Now remember, at the time, they were just kids and teenagers. But despite that, their passion for music was undeniable. While their peers were stuck in school, they were out there honing their craft, pouring their hearts into their sound. Eventually, they changed their name to Noble Five, and just like that, they started landing gigs at local dances. At this point, some payment was rolling in, but not exactly in money. They'll get paid in drinks and sometimes gas money, and they were happy about that. Little did they know, they had even more coming their way. But believe it or not everyone was a fan of Ronnie Van Zant's band in their early days. Back when they were still finding their sound, they had so much passion, but nowhere to practice. So they practiced wherever they could, usually in the living rooms of their parents' houses. And as you can imagine, it wasn't long before the neighbors got fed up with the constant racket. They'd call the cops to try and shut the band down, forcing them to keep moving from house to house, depending on which parents could tolerate the noise that week. Enough to make a young man quit, isn't it? But Ronnie was no quitter. With a little help from his old man, Ronnie and the rest of the Noble Five found a new place to practice, a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of Jacksonville. They nicknamed it Hell House. It was small, hot, and definitely not in prime condition, but it was theirs. It was far away from the polished quiet of suburbia, a place where they could turn up the volume without worrying about the neighbors calling the cops. Hell House became their sanctuary, a place to crank up their amps and sharpen their sound, shaping the future of Southern rock. Those early years at Hell House weren't just about practicing, they were about experimenting. Ronnie and his bandmates weren't content with sticking to one identity, so they kept trying out new names. They booked gigs around town under aliases like the Wildcats, the Sons of Satan, Conqueror Worm, the Pretty Ones, and even 1%. But it was an act of rebellion that led them to the name that stuck. But sometimes they were up to no good. When they weren't at Hell House, the band was busy causing trouble at school. All of them, except for guitarist Alan Collins, went to Robert E. Lee High School. And if you know anything about rock and roll, you can probably guess that they weren't big fans of the school's dress code. Sideburns above the ears, hair off the collar, belts on, shirts tucked in. Yeah, none of that screamed rock star. But Ronnie had a trick up his sleeve, or rather, in his hair. He slicked it back with Vaseline to keep it from touching his collar. It fooled most of the teachers, but not one. The gym coach. Now, if you're wondering why we're talking about the gym coach, the reason will blow your mind. This coach had a habit of patrolling the showers, making sure everyone was following the rules, and he definitely wasn't fooled by Ronnie's slicked-back trick. He caught Ronnie and the band, with their hair dripping wet and hanging long over their collars, which meant another trip to the principal's office and, eventually, suspensions. One of those suspensions was the last straw for guitarist Gary Rossington. After getting fed up with the gym teacher's constant badgering, he flipped the guy off and dropped out of school. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Not long after, the band played a show at the Forest Inn, and Ronnie had a flash of genius. In front of a crowd full of Robert E. Lee High School students, he announced that the band was changing their name, inspired by none other than their gym teacher, Leonard Skinner. The name was meant to be a dig at the strict enforcer of school rules, but it ended up sticking. Leonard Skinner was born, and with their new name, Ronnie and his crew quickly became a fixture in the Jacksonville music scene. But sliding away from school and his music for a bit, Ronnie's personal life was a roller coaster of emotions, and it molded him into the man the world knew him as. By January 1967, he met Nadine Insko, and a while later they were married, and like that wasn't enough, the two welcomed a beautiful daughter named Tammy. For a little while, everything was great. Life was amazing. It seemed like Ronnie was ready to settle down. He even took a job at his brother-in-law's auto parts store, and for some reason, he was really good at it. But in reality, Ronnie Van Zant was never cut out for the quiet life of a family man. Before long, he grew restless and wanted more out of life and out of love. Around that same time that his marriage with Nadine was falling apart, he met Judy Seymour. By the early 70s, Ronnie and Judy were married and welcoming a new chapter in his life, one that would see him fully dive back into his rock and roll dreams. But when it comes to dreams, no one is a bigger dreamer than Ronnie Van Zant. And in the early 1970s, he proved it. It all started when the band recorded a demo, and Capricorn Records offered them a deal. It's exactly the kind of opportunity you grab with both hands, but Ronnie shocked the world when she turned it down. He believed he and his band were worth more, and would rather take his chances than sell out like that. So, instead of signing right away, he spent the next 3 years grinding it out with the band, playing dive bars and logging long hours on the road. They traveled for miles between gigs, slowly but surely maturing their sound. As they upgraded their gear, they grew into masters of that distinctive southern rock rhythm. Despite their southern roots and themes in their lyrics, Van Zant often claimed that Lynyrd Skynyrd's sound wasn't purely southern rock. Instead, he saw it as more continental, shaped by their admiration for British invasion bands of the 1960s. After years of refining their style and paying their dues, their perseverance finally paid off when MCA came knocking in 1973 with a better record deal. One Van Zant couldn't refuse, and just like that, they signed with MCA, and it was a way better deal than the last one. And now, it was uphill from here. Shortly after signing, the band released their self-titled debut album, which turned out to be an instant hit. It featured now classic tracks like Tuesday's Gone, Simple Man, and their anthem, Freebird. Van Zant wrote the melody and lyrics for Freebird in just 3 minutes, a song that would become synonymous with the band. During one performance, later included on their 1976 live album, One More from the Road, Van Zant famously asked the crowd what they wanted to hear. When they roared back with Freebird, the band obliged with a soaring 14-minute rendition, cementing their place in rock history. That moment even sparked a long-standing joke among concertgoers. When other rock icons like Nirvana or Bob Dylan would ask their audiences what they wanted to hear, fans would shout back, "Freebird," in tribute to Lynyrd Skynyrd. Van Zant was in his element on stage, always performing barefoot, feeling at home in front of a crowd. He was so great at commanding the stage, but most people may not realize where that came from. The legend, Mick Jagger. The first time Ronnie Van Zant met Mick Jagger, it was like two worlds colliding. It was the mid-1970s, at the height of Lynyrd Skynyrd's rise to fame. Their meeting occurred backstage at a European festival, where Lynyrd Skynyrd was opening for the Rolling Stones. The southern rock band from Jacksonville had been making waves in the US, but to share the stage with the Stones on an international tour was a whole new level. Ronnie, usually known for his brash confidence, found himself in awe. But Jagger, seeing a kindred spirit in the gritty frontman, broke the ice with his signature charm. Jagger had heard the buzz about Lynyrd Skynyrd and their rebellious, raw energy, and he knew Ronnie had something special, an authenticity that resonated with the working-class roots of rock and roll. They chatted about music, the industry, and their shared love of blues, with Jagger offering advice and encouragement that Ronnie would never forget. Mick Jagger saw in Ronnie a fire and a determination that reminded him of the Stones' own early struggles. He shared stories of how the Stones had fought for their place in the music scene, urging Ronnie to stay true to his sound and never let the industry dilute what made him unique. But that was not all. Jagger introduced Ronnie to influential figures in the European music scene, helping Skynyrd secure more prominent slots at festivals, and offering tips on how to handle the pressures of sudden fame. This support played a crucial role in Lynyrd Skynyrd's ability to break into the European market, where they began to build a fan base that matched their explosive popularity back home. But perhaps most importantly, Jagger taught Ronnie the art of commanding a stage. As they shared a drink backstage one night, Jagger told him, "The crowd can smell fear, mate. You own that stage, and they'll follow you anywhere." It was advice Ronnie took to heart, and it showed in his performances, his swagger, his fearless strut, and the way he commanded the audience's attention. Ronnie's stage presence transformed, blending his southern roots with a newfound rock and roll edge, and Lynyrd Skynyrd's shows became legendary. But while his long hair and bare feet might have suggested a laid-back attitude, he was far from a hippie. What most people don't realize is that he had a reputation for a fiery temper, and his bandmates knew it all too well. One time, when he caught a bandmate sipping wine on stage during a song, he punched him in the mouth. Allegedly, he did the same to another who got distracted by a fan mid-performance. Those were his easy ways of handling things. But it gets even worse. By the mid-70s, Van Zant and his bandmates had become known as hard-drinking troublemakers, always up for a brawl. When they ran out of external enemies, they often fought among themselves, sometimes leaving their dressing rooms in shambles. Regardless, despite their chaotic lifestyle, Lynyrd Skynyrd continued to rise, releasing 4 more albums between 1974 and 1976. Everything was good, like it could not be any better. But soon enough, their fast-paced life caught up with them in a way they never saw coming. In 1976, they hit 2 major setbacks. First, Alan Collins crashed his car into another vehicle after drinking, and a few months later, Gary Rossington fell asleep behind the wheel, smashing his car into a telephone pole and oak tree, causing thousands of dollars in damage. But you won't believe what happened next. Because the injuries forced the band to cancel tour dates, Van Zant didn't coddle his bandmates. Instead, he fined them each $5,000. He was known for being strict when it came to his band and his music, a little bit of a perfectionist. But soon enough, the hardest hit yet was about to come his way. On October 20th, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd boarded a flight from Greenville to Baton Rouge. During the trip, the aircraft ran out of fuel just outside Gillsburg, Mississippi. The passengers, aware of potential issues with the plane, were warned to brace for impact. The crash proved devastating. Ronnie Van Zant died on impact, suffering fatal head injuries after the plane struck a tree. Alongside him, bandmates Steve Gaines and Cassie Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and the plane's pilot and co-pilot, Walter McCreary and William Gray, lost their lives. The rest of the band sustained serious injuries. Van Zant was just 29 years old. And this ended the life of one of the best and most promising talents in the industry. A sad fate for a promising star.